The house on Magnolia Ridge Drive looked exactly like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. It sat perfectly manicured in a quiet, affluent suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. It boasted crisp white siding, a sprawling wraparound porch with hanging ferns and custom teal shutters, a deep, rich shade of teal that my stepmother, Renee, had spent 3 agonizing weeks selecting just to ensure we had the most striking facade on the cul-de-sac. People drove past our driveway, saw the pristine lawn and the welcome mat that read "Home Sweet Home" in faded gold cursive, and they thought to themselves, "Somebody happy lives there." They were dead wrong. Inside that house lived me. My name is Jade. I was 21 years old, and I had not felt the warmth of happiness in a very long time. If you looked closely at me, you would see my mother's eyes. They were wide, dark, and observant, the kind of eyes that learned to read a room before stepping fully into it. I kept my dark, thick hair pulled back into a tight, practical bun at the nape of my neck, mostly because there was never any time to fix it properly. My wardrobe consisted of the same 3 faded cotton shirts, cycled on an endless loop, washing them by hand in the basement sink so I wouldn't waste Renee's good laundry detergent. My alarm clock never rang because I never set one. I woke up at 5:30 every single morning, my internal clock conditioned by fear and routine because Renee expected breakfast hot, plated, and perfect on the dining room table by exactly 6 a.m. It wasn't always this way. My real mother, a beautiful, vibrant woman who filled our home with jazz music and the smell of sweet potato pie, passed away when I was 7. My father, a proud, hard-working man who owned a successful local logistics company, was shattered. He tried to hold the pieces of our lives together, but the grief was a heavy coat he couldn't take off. 2 years later, he met Renee. Renee was polished, sharp, and carried herself with the kind of demanding presence that commanded the room. My father, desperate for stability and a mother figure for me, married her quickly. For a brief window of time, we looked like a restored family. But then, the unthinkable happened. My father got sick. The illness was aggressive, stripping him of his strength and eventually his life within 18 months. I was 17 when we buried him. I remember the oppressive Georgia heat on the day of the funeral, the black dresses, the somber faces of his colleagues. But what I remember most vividly is what happened after, when the last of the extended relatives drove away, their taillights disappearing down Magnolia Ridge. The house went violently quiet. Renee stood in the foyer, slowly locking the deadbolt. She turned and looked at me. It wasn't a look of shared grief. It wasn't a look of maternal comfort. It was a look of cold, hard calculation. That was 4 years ago. Since that day, I had become something Renee didn't have a polite word for in public. At church or neighborhood block parties, I was her brave stepdaughter. But privately, in the suffocating walls of that house, in the sharp, clipped way she spoke to me, the word was crystal clear: burden. I cooked every meal. I scrubbed the hardwood floors until my knees ached. I ran every errand, managed the grocery budget down to the final cent, and kept the teal exterior of the house looking flawless. I had a college degree in business administration earned mostly through grueling night classes and sheer willpower, sitting in a cheap manila folder in my dresser drawer. Renee had never once asked to see it. I had applied for 3 entry-level corporate jobs the previous year, desperate to build a runway to escape. I didn't know it at the time, but Renee had intercepted the mail and thrown away 2 callback letters from prominent Atlanta firms. She needed a maid, not a daughter, and she wasn't about to let free labor walk out the front door. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October when the foundation of my life cracked wide open. The Georgia sky was flat, gray, and unforgiving, signaling an early winter chill. Inside, the house was stifling. Renee was sprawled on the living room sofa, a cashmere throw draped over her legs, watching a luxury home renovation show with the volume cranked up so loud it rattled the picture frames. I was in the kitchen, standing over the island. I was pressing a damp, cold dishcloth to a fresh burn on my left wrist, a parting gift from the oven rack while I was pulling out her midday batch of roasted pecans. My head was pounding, the dull ache of exhaustion settling behind my eyes. Then I heard it. It is a knock at the front door. It wasn't the sharp, authoritative rap of a delivery driver, nor the eager tapping of a neighbor. It's the hesitant, heavy sound. Renee huffed, deeply annoyed at the interruption. She muted the massive television, the sudden silence in the house feeling almost thicker than the noise. She stood up slowly, smoothed out her immaculate silk blouse, and walked toward the foyer. I watched her from the kitchen archway. She wore a very specific, tight little smile, the expression she always adopted when she was about to enjoy herself at someone else's expense. She swung the heavy oak door open. Standing on our pristine porch was a black man, maybe 26 or 27 years old. He was tall, but his frame was hollowed out, thin in that specific, sharp way people get when they've missed entirely too many meals. He was swimming in a faded, oversized canvas jacket that offered no real protection from the October wind. His boots were scuffed, the leather splitting along the left toe. But his face stopped me cold. Beneath the exhaustion, he had a strong, defined jawline and high cheekbones. And his eyes, they didn't match his ragged clothes, but were dark, steady, and incredibly quiet. There was no frantic desperation in them, no begging, just a deep, profound weariness. His name, I would later learn, was Marcus, and while he looked like a man who had lost everything, I had absolutely no idea that the man shivering on our welcome mat was actually a billionaire who had built a tech empire from the ground up. But in that exact moment, to Renee, he was just dirt on her porch. "Ma'am!" His voice was low, a rich baritone roughened by the cold. "I'm sorry to bother you. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. If you have anything you could spare, a piece of bread, an apple, I'd be truly grateful." Renee looked him up and down. She didn't look at him with pity. She looked at him the way she looked at the silverfish she occasionally found trapped in the bathtub. "You're a young, able-bodied man," she said, her voice dripping with southern condescension. "Why aren't you out working?" "I'm looking, ma'am," Marcus replied, his tone remaining perfectly level, though I saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. "It's hard to secure a job when you don't have a permanent address to put on the application." Renee made a sharp, clicking sound with her tongue that wasn't quite a laugh. She leaned against the doorframe, clearly entertained by the power dynamic. Then, she turned her head slightly and called over her shoulder. "Jade, come here." My stomach dropped. I pulled the damp cloth away from my burned wrist, wiped my hands nervously on my apron, and stepped out of the kitchen. I walked to the foyer, stopping a few feet behind Renee. I looked past her shoulder at the man on the porch. Marcus looked back at me. For a split second, the weariness in his eyes shifted into something else. A flicker of recognition, not of who I was, but of what I was. Game recognizes game. Pain recognizes pain. Neither of us said a word. "Pour this man a glass of tap water," Renee commanded without looking at me. I turned without a word, went back to the kitchen, and filled a tall glass. When I returned to the door, I stepped around Renee and held the glass out to him. Marcus reached for it. His hands were large, calloused, and freezing cold. He took the glass carefully with both hands, cradling it as if I had just handed him a fragile piece of crystal. "Thank you," he said softly. He didn't say it to Renee. He looked directly into my eyes. I gave a small, barely perceptible nod and started to step back inside the house, ready to retreat to the safety of the kitchen. And then Renee said it. She said it so casually, with the same breezy tone she used when deciding what pastry to order at the corner bakery. "Liquor." Marcus froze, the glass of water pausing halfway to his mouth. He blinked, clearly confused. "Excuse me?" "Her!" Renee lifted her perfectly manicured hand and pointed a long, accusatory finger directly at my chest. "Take her with you. She's yours. Consider it my charity for the year." The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the wind rushing through the hanging ferns on the porch. The dishcloth I was still holding slipped through my numb fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a soft, wet slap. I slowly turned to look at the woman who had lived in my house, eaten the food I cooked, and slept under the roof my father built for the last 6 years. I waited for the smirk. I waited for the cruel chuckle. I waited for the part where she told me she was just trying to teach me a lesson about gratitude. Renee was not joking. Her face was a mask of cold, hard stone. "She's 21 years old," Renee continued, her voice completely devoid of emotion, speaking about me as if I were a defective appliance she was tossing to the curb. "She eats my food, she uses my water, she takes up space in my house. I have been carrying her dead weight for 4 years since her father died, and I am absolutely done. You want something from this house? Take her, I'm not giving you anything else." Marcus stared at her, horrified. He lowered the glass. "Ma'am, I can't do that. I don't even have a place to sleep tonight. I live on the streets." "Not my problem," Renee snapped. She turned and looked me dead in the eyes, and in that moment the veil dropped completely. I saw it all. There was no underlying affection, no lingering sense of duty to my father, not even a shred of basic human discomfort. There was just nothing. 4 years of nothingness finally showing its true, hideous face. She didn't want me here, and she had finally found the excuse she needed to discard me like trash. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The sheer audacity of the cruelty bypassed my tear ducts and settled directly into my spine, hardening into a rod of pure ice. I turned around and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. I stood in the doorway for exactly 10 seconds, cataloging the space that had been my entire world. It was a small room at the back of the house. There was the narrow twin bed, the faded, hand-stitched patchwork quilt my real mother had made for me when I was a toddler, the neat stack of borrowed library books in the corner, and on the nightstand a silver-framed photograph of my father, smiling broadly, holding me on his shoulders at a Braves game. I walked over and picked up the photograph. My thumb traced the glass over his smiling face. "I'm sorry, Daddy," I thought. "I can't stay here anymore." I pulled my old black canvas backpack out from beneath the bed. I didn't have much, which made packing efficient. I grabbed my 3 t-shirts, my 1 good pair of heavy denim jeans, and the manila folder containing my college degree and birth certificate. I grabbed my mother's quilt, rolling it up tightly and shoving it into the main compartment until the zipper threatened to split. Finally, I grabbed 1 book. Just one. A worn paperback copy of The Alchemist. My mother used to read it to me before the cancer took her voice. I zipped the bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked back down the hallway. When I reached the foyer, Renee was standing with her arms crossed, watching me. Marcus was still standing on the porch, holding a glass of water, looking like he was trapped in a surreal nightmare. I didn't look at Renee. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a goodbye or a plea or a tear. I stepped past her, crossed the threshold, and walked out onto the porch. The cold October air hit my face, but I barely felt it. I walked down the 3 wooden steps and started moving down the paved driveway toward the street. I heard the dull clunk of the water glass being set down on the porch railing. Then footsteps behind me. Marcus was following. Behind us, the heavy oak door slammed shut. The sound echoed down the quiet street. A second later, the sharp, metallic click of the deadbolt locking into place sealed my fate. We walked. We didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. We just walked side by side down Magnolia Ridge Drive, past the identical sprawling lawns, the luxury SUVs in the driveways, the perfect, oblivious lives happening behind closed doors. We kept walking until the manicured sidewalks gave way to cracked concrete, until the towering oak trees were replaced by the harsh, flickering neon signs of the city's neglected outskirts. The wind picked up, biting through my thin sweater. I pulled my arms tight across my chest. Finally, the silence broke. "You didn't have to come," Marcus said. His voice was rough, carrying a mixture of guilt and disbelief. I kept my eyes on the cracked pavement ahead of us. "I know." "You could go back," he pressed, stopping on the sidewalk and turning to face me. The streetlights caught the sharp angles of his face. "You could go back right now. Call the police. Tell them what you did. Call a relative. Someone would help you. You don't have to be out here." I stopped walking. I looked up at the darkening Atlanta sky, the clouds thick and heavy with impending rain. I thought about the last 4 years. The isolation. The way my father's family had slowly stopped calling, convinced by Renee's polite lies that we were doing just fine. I looked at Marcus. "She's been doing this to me for 4 years," I said quietly, the truth hanging heavy in the cold air. She just finally said it out loud today. Nobody helped me then. Nobody's coming to help me now. Marcus stared at me, his dark eyes searching my face for any sign of wavering. He found none. He didn't have an answer for that kind of bleak reality, mostly because he knew it intimately himself. He gave a slow, solemn nod. We started walking again. By the time the sun fully vanished, pulling the temperature down with it, we had reached the edge of the industrial district. It was the part of the city people only drove through with their doors locked and their eyes straight ahead. We passed an abandoned bus depot, a boarded-up laundromat with shattered windows, and finally came to a massive, looming concrete parking structure that looked like a forgotten relic of the 1980s. Half the harsh yellow security lights were burned out. Marcus stopped at the entrance, scanning the shadows with practiced eyes. "Third level," he said, his voice dropping into a hushed, protective tone. "It's dry up there. The wind gets blocked by the retaining wall. It's warmer than the street." I nodded, adjusting the heavy straps of my backpack, acting as though sleeping in an abandoned parking garage was just another Tuesday evening routine. We climbed the concrete stairs, the smell of damp earth and old oil heavy in the air. We found a secluded corner on the 3rd floor tucked behind a massive concrete support pillar. It was dark, hidden from the street below. Marcus unslung a tightly rolled, ragged sleeping bag from his shoulder. He laid it out on the hard concrete and gestured for me to sit. "Take it," he said. "I can't take your bed," I protested, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. He shook his head once, a definitive, non-negotiable movement. He backed away, sitting down on the bare concrete with his back pressed against the pillar, pulling the collar of his thin jacket up around his neck. "I'm used to the cold. You aren't. Sit down, Jade." I sat on the edge of the sleeping bag, pulling my knees up to my chest. The reality of the situation was starting to set in, a slow, creeping panic threatening to claw its way up my throat. But I forced it down. In the heavy darkness, illuminated only by the distant orange glow of a street lamp, Marcus spoke again. "In the dark," he said softly. "What was it like before she got like that?" I rested my chin on my knees, thinking back to the days before my father got sick. "I don't think there was a before for her," I whispered. "I think she was always exactly who she showed us today. I think I just spent 4 years exhausting myself, hoping I was wrong about her." I heard the rustle of his jacket as he nodded slowly. "I used to do that too," he murmured. I turned my head to look at his silhouette. "With who?" "My older brother," Marcus said, the pain in his voice raw and unpolished. "After our folks passed, he took me in. I was just a teenager. I worked his auto shop for free, did everything he asked. I thought, at least I have family. Then one day, I came back from running a part across town. The locks on the apartment were changed. All my belongings were stuffed into 2 black trash bags sitting on the curb in the rain. He sold the shop and moved out of state the next morning. Never left a number." Silence stretched between us, thick and shared. A car rumbled past on the street far below. A stray dog barked in the distance. We were 2 strangers, discarded by the very people tasked with protecting us, sitting on the concrete floor of a forgotten world. "Why were you asking for food on Magnolia Ridge today?" I asked, genuinely curious. "It's a gated community. It's a long walk from here. Why that specific street?" Marcus shifted his weight against the pillar. "It was completely random," he admitted. "When I get hungry enough, I just walk. I keep walking until I find a neighborhood that doesn't feel overtly hostile, a place that looks soft." He paused, and even in the dim light, I could see his eyes locked on me. "Your porch had those hanging ferns, and the flower beds, they looked cared for." A strange, dry sound escaped my throat. It was a laugh, cracked and rusty because I hadn't used one in so long. I had almost forgotten the mechanics of it. "I planted those," I said softly. "I watered them every single morning." I know, Marcus said quietly. Nobody who hated that house would have kept those flowers alive. I looked at him for a long time. I saw the shivering in his shoulders, the way he tried to hide how deeply the cold was seeping into his bones. Without a word, I unzipped my backpack. I pulled out the patchwork quilt my mother had made. It smelled faintly of lavender and the cedar chest it used to live in. I stood up, walked over to him, and threw half of the heavy, warm quilt across his lap, sitting down beside him so the fabric stretched over both of us. Marcus stiffened, surprised by the sudden warmth in the proximity. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We sat there in the dark, shoulder to shoulder beneath my mother's quilt, watching the city lights flicker below. I didn't know that the man shivering next to me had millions of dollars sitting in frozen, heavily contested offshore accounts, tied up in a vicious corporate betrayal that had temporarily forced him off the grid. I didn't know that within a year the two of us would flip the entire world upside down. All I knew as I closed my eyes against the concrete pillar was that for the first time in 4 years I didn't feel entirely alone. The morning sun did not gently wake us. It arrived like a harsh interrogation light, slicing through the concrete pillars of the parking garage. My body ached in places I didn't know could hurt, the cold having seeped past my mother's quilt and settled deep into my joints. I sat up, rubbing the grit from my eyes. Marcus was already awake. He was standing near the edge of the 3rd level, leaning against the half wall, looking out over the waking city of Atlanta. His canvas jacket was zipped up to his chin, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I stood up, folding the quilt with practiced precision, treating it with the same reverence I would a sacred text. When I walked over to join him at the wall, he didn't turn his head, but his posture softened slightly, acknowledging my presence. "You sleep at all?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "A few hours," I lied. "Me neither," he replied, catching the lie and letting it pass without judgment. He looked down at the streets. Traffic was beginning to pulse through the arteries of the industrial district delivery trucks, weary commuters, the machinery of a city that didn't care if you were drowning. "We need to move. Security usually sweeps this level around 7. I hoisted my heavy black backpack onto my shoulders. "Where are we going?" Marcus looked at me then. His dark eyes were calculating, running through a series of invisible options. "There's a day labor spot about 2 miles south of here. They take walk-ins. It's grueling, but they pay cash at the end of the shift. If we can get picked up, we can eat tonight." "Okay," I said simply. "Let's go." The walk took 45 minutes. The biting wind of the previous night had been replaced by a damp, heavy chill that promised rain. By the time we arrived at the address, a massive, corrugated steel warehouse flanked by a chain-link fence, a line of men had already formed near a rusted loading dock. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and stale tobacco. I was the only woman in the line. I felt the heavy, sidelong glances from the other men, eyes that lingered too long on my thin frame and my faded clothes. I pulled my arms tighter across my chest, stepping closer to Marcus. Without a word, he shifted his body, positioning himself slightly in front of me, a silent but absolute barrier between me and the rest of the line. It was a small gesture, but it sent a shockwave of warmth through my chest. For 4 years, I had been the one protecting myself. At exactly 8 o'clock, a heavy metal door rolled open with a deafening screech. A thick-necked man with a clipboard and a permanent scowl stepped out. His name tag read Desmond. He looked over the crowd like a rancher inspecting livestock. "Need 12 bodies for the shipping floor," Desmond barked over the hum of a nearby forklift. "Heavy lifting, pallet stacking. If you've got a bad back, step out now. 15 an hour, cash at 5 o'clock. He started pointing at men. You in the red hat." When his finger landed on Marcus, Desmond paused, looking at his worn boots and hollowed cheeks. "You look like a strong breeze. Could knock you over, son." "I can work," Marcus said, his voice level, stripped of any pride but completely void of begging. "I'll outwork any 2 men you put me next to." Desmond snorted, but he nodded. "Fine, you're in." He turned to go back inside. "Wait," I said. The word jumped out of my throat before I could stop it. Desmond turned around, his brow furrowing as he finally noticed me standing behind Marcus. We don't need office help, sweetheart. Floor work only. My heart hammered against my ribs, but the 4 years of surviving Renee's psychological warfare had forged a peculiar kind of armor around me. I stepped out from behind Marcus. I looked Desmond dead in the eye, pulling my shoulders back. I mentally summoned the ghost of the woman who had earned a business degree while scrubbing baseboards at 2 a.m. I'm not looking for office work, I said, my voice steady, projecting over the industrial noise. I know how to manage inventory software. I know the SAP logistics system, and I can run your incoming freight manifests twice as fast as whoever you have doing it right now. Give me a trial shift. If I don't clear your backlog by noon, you don't have to pay me. The entire line of men went dead silent. Marcus looked at me, his eyes widening in sheer surprise. Desmond stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He looked from my frayed t-shirt to my dark, unwavering eyes. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that was more of a cough. You know SAP? Out here on the street? Well? Yes, sir, I said, not breaking eye contact. Try me. Desmond rubbed the thick stubble on his chin. My manifest girl walked out on Tuesday. The dock supervisor is having a stroke trying to log the incoming freights. Come on back, both of you. The warehouse was a cathedral of chaos. It was cavernous, smelling of cardboard, shrink wrap, and sweat. Forklifts zipped between towering aisles of goods like mechanical insects. They put Marcus on the loading dock, tasked with manually breaking down towering pallets of heavy merchandise and stacking them onto conveyor belts. They put me in a small glass-walled office suspended above the floor, facing a computer system that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2015. I sat down, my fingers hovering over the greasy keyboard. I took a deep breath, letting the familiar logic of numbers and systems wash over me. It was like speaking a language I hadn't been allowed to use in years. I went to work. I organized their messy spreadsheets, streamlined the intake codes, and cleared a 3-day backlog of manifests in exactly 3.5 hours. The dock supervisor, a frantic man named Lou, practically kissed me when he saw the cleared screen. Through the glass wall of the office I could see Marcus. I watched him as I worked, and something about him struck me as profoundly strange. He didn't move like a man who was just trying to survive the hour. He moved with an incredible, terrifying efficiency. He didn't just stack the boxes, he reorganized the pallet configurations as he unloaded them, creating a faster, more aerodynamic flow for the men working down the line from him. He anticipated where the forklift drivers needed space before they even honked their horns. It was as if his brain was naturally wired to optimize systems on a massive scale. I watched him lift a heavy crate, his jaw set, sweat dripping down his temples, and I wondered who he really was. At 5 p.m. the whistle blew. We stood in the narrow hallway outside Desmond's office. I was handed an envelope with $120. Marcus was handed an envelope with $120. We walked out of the warehouse as the sun was beginning to set, casting long purple shadows across the cracked pavement. My legs felt like lead and my hands were cramped from typing, but the heavy envelopes in our pockets felt like a miracle. $240, I breathed, stopping under a flickering streetlight. I looked at Marcus. His face was smeared with dust and there was a fresh, angry scrape along his forearm, but he was looking at me with a soft, genuine smile. You got us in there, Marcus said quietly. I would have just been another set of hands, but you made them see us. You're incredible, Jade. I felt a hot flush rise to my cheeks. I looked down at my worn sneakers. I just knew what to say. No, he corrected gently. You knew your worth, even when the world told you not to. We walked to a 24-hour diner 3 blocks away. It was cheap, brightly lit, and smelled like old frying oil, but it was heaven. We ordered massive plates of eggs, hash browns, and heavily buttered toast. We ate in near silence for the first 10 minutes, our bodies desperately absorbing the calories. As I sipped my black coffee, I looked across the booth at him. How did you know how to do that today? I asked. Marcus paused, a piece of toast halfway to his mouth. Do what? Organize the dock floor, I said, leaning forward. I watched you from the office. You weren't just lifting boxes. You routed the entire loading pattern. You increased their efficiency by at least 30%, Marcus. People who sleep in parking garages don't usually map out macro logistics in their heads. For a fraction of a second, a shadow passed over his face, a momentary panic, a shield slamming shut. He lowered the toast, wiping his mouth with a paper napkin. He looked out the rain-streaked window of the diner. I used to read a lot, he said carefully, his voice dropping lower. Before things got bad. I like puzzles. That's all a warehouse is, Jade, just a giant puzzle. It was a deflection, and we both knew it. But I also knew what it was like to hide pieces of yourself for survival. I didn't push. Well, I said, changing the subject, we have enough money for a cheap motel tonight. We can get showers. Sleep in a real bed. Marcus nodded, his shoulders relaxing. We found a place called the Starlight on the edge of the district. It was $50 a night, cash only. The neon sign buzzed ominously, and the carpet in room 114 smelled of stale smoke and bleach, but there was a hot shower and 2 double beds. I took a shower first. Standing under the stinging hot water, I watched the dirt and exhaustion of the last 48 hours swirl down the drain. I closed my eyes and allowed myself exactly 1 minute to cry. I cried for my father. I cried for the bedroom I would never see again, and I cried because my wrists finally didn't ache from scrubbing Renee's floors. Then I turned the water off, dried my face, and buried the grief back down where it belonged. When I came out, dressed in my clean change of clothes, Marcus was sitting on the edge of the bed farthest from the door. He had taken off his canvas jacket. His t-shirt was thin, revealing the sharp, lean muscle underneath, but also revealing a jagged, faded scar running along his collarbone. He took his shower quickly. When he emerged, his thick hair damp and his face clean, he looked younger. The exhaustion was still there, but the layer of grime that had masked his features was gone. He was undeniably, strikingly handsome. We sat on our respective beds, the space between us filled with the hum of the cheap air conditioning unit. I pulled my mother's quilt out of my backpack and spread it over my bed. I'm going to go back tomorrow, I said to the ceiling, lying back against the stiff pillows. Desmond said if we show up at 7, he'll guarantee our spots. I'm going too, Marcus said from the darkness of his bed. If we work for 2 weeks, we'll have enough to put down a deposit on a weekly rental, a real room, somewhere safe. I was talking fast, making plans, building a wall of logic against the terrifying unknown. Jade, Marcus said. His voice was soft, cutting through my anxious rambling. I rolled onto my side, looking at him across the gap between the beds. Yeah? Why are you doing this? He asked, the moonlight from the window catching the whites of his eyes. You could have taken your money today, rented your own room, and left me behind. I'm nothing to you. I'm just the guy your stepmother threw you away to. I thought about his question. I thought about the way he had stepped in front of me in line. I thought about the way he had shared the cold concrete floor without complaining. Because, I said, my voice barely a whisper in the dark motel room, nobody ever gave me a reason to stay before, and nobody ever gave you a reason to trust them. I pulled the quilt up to my chin. We're a team now, Marcus, whether you like it or not. I heard a soft exhale from his side of the room. It sounded like a man letting go of a breath he had been holding for a very long time. I like it, he said softly. 2 months is a strange measurement of time. In the grand scheme of a life, it's nothing but a blip, a passing season. But when you are clawing your way out of the abyss, 60 days can feel like an entire lifetime. By the middle of December, the biting October chill had hardened into a bitter, bone-deep Atlanta winter. And yet, I had never felt warmer. We were no longer sleeping on the concrete floor of the parking structure. After 14 days of grueling, unbroken shifts at the warehouse, Marcus and I had saved exactly enough cash to secure a weekly rental. It was a tiny, one-room apartment on the second floor of a crumbling brick building on Mott Street, right above a 24-hour dry cleaner. The air in our room constantly smelled faintly of industrial starch and harsh pressing chemicals, and the radiator in the corner clanked and hissed like a dying engine every night at 2 a.m. To anyone from Magnolia Ridge, it would have been a nightmare. To me, it was a palace. We had one narrow window that looked out over an alleyway, a hot plate sitting on a scuffed laminate counter, and two small cots shoved against opposite walls. We didn't have a television. We didn't have a sofa, but we had a heavy deadbolt on the door, and for the first time in 4 years I held the only key. Our routine became a religion. We woke up at 4:30 a.m. in the pitch black. I would boil water on the hot plate and make instant coffee, pouring it into two mismatched ceramic mugs we bought for 50 cents each at a thrift store down the block. We would sit on the edge of our respective cots, the steam rising in the dim light, sipping in comfortable silence before lacing up our boots and walking the 2 miles to the warehouse. Desmond, the gruff hiring manager with the permanent coffee stain on his shirt, had kept his word. After my first day organizing the chaotic SAP logistics system, he had marched into the office, fired the temp agency they had been using, and hired me full-time as the lead freight coordinator. Marcus was kept on the loading dock, lifting, stacking, and organizing the endless flow of inbound pallets. Every evening we would walk back to Mott Street, our bodies aching and covered in a fine layer of cardboard dust. I would cook dinner, usually rice and beans or cheap cuts of chicken cooked slow in a pawn shop slow cooker, and we would sit on the floor with our plates resting on a milk crate. This was when the silence would break. Over those 2 months, I started to realize that the man sitting across from me was an enigma wrapped in a riddle. Marcus never spoke about his past, but his brilliance leaked out in quiet, unexpected ways. When I was struggling to balance the warehouse budget on my outdated laptop, he would glance over my shoulder and casually point out a mathematical error in a complex spreadsheet formula without even pausing his bite of food. When we walked past a broken-down delivery truck in the alley, I watched him diagnose a failing alternator just by listening to the specific rhythm of the engine sputtering. I didn't push him. We both had our ghosts. Mine lived in a pristine teal house in the suburbs. His lived somewhere behind his dark, guarded eyes. I was just grateful for the peace. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't being told I was a burden. I was a partner. But the quiet rhythm of our survival was violently interrupted 2 weeks before Christmas. The warehouse on Kellner Street handled distribution for several major national retailers. The second week of December was always referred to as Hell Week by the veteran workers. The volume of incoming freight tripled. The trucks were lined up down the block, diesel engines idling, drivers screaming at the dock workers. The air inside the warehouse was thick with panic and exhaust. It happened on a Thursday morning at exactly 10:15 a.m. I was in the suspended glass office, my fingers flying across the keyboard, desperately trying to load the incoming pallets so the floor workers knew where to route them. Suddenly, my computer screen froze. A fatal error message flashed in stark white letters across a blue background. I hit the escape key. Nothing. I tried to force a reboot. The system groaned, the hard drive spinning frantically, and then the entire network simply died. Down on the floor, the barcode scanners held by the dock workers emitted a simultaneous high-pitched error beep. The conveyor belts ground to a halt, but digital routing boards above the loading bays went completely black. "What happened?" Desmond bellowed, bursting out of his ground floor office, his face flushed purple with rage. "Why did the belts stop?" Lou, the dock supervisor, was frantically hitting his scanner against a metal support beam as if physical violence would fix a software crash. "The mainframe is down, Des. The scanners aren't reading the manifests. We're blind." Panic erupted. Within 10 minutes, the entire warehouse was in gridlock. Without the routing software, the workers had no idea which pallets went to which outgoing trucks. We were taking in $50,000 of inventory every hour, and it had nowhere to go. If a truck missed its departure window, the warehouse was hit with a massive financial penalty by the corporate retailers. I rushed out of the office and ran down the metal stairs to the floor. I pushed through the crowd of confused, shouting men and found Desmond screaming into his cell phone. "What do you mean you can't get it out here until tomorrow?" Desmond roared at whoever was on the other end. I have 30 trucks backed up on Kellner Street. I'm going to lose the primary distribution contract. Fix it remotely. He paused, his face falling. What do you mean the server is completely corrupted? He slammed the phone against a pallet of televisions and grabbed his hair. We're done, he muttered, his voice dropping an octave. Corporate is going to shut this branch down. We're totally blind. Desmond, I said, stepping up to him. I tried to run a diagnostic from my terminal. The local server blew out. The routing matrix is completely erased. We have to do it by hand. By hand? Lou yelled, his eyes wide with panic. Jade, there are 4,000 pallets on the floor. By the time we log them manually, the Christmas deadline will be blown. We're all losing our jobs today. Suddenly, a voice cut through the chaos. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight and authority that silenced the men around us. You don't need to do it by hand. We all turned. Marcus was standing near the edge of the loading dock. He had stripped off his heavy jacket, wearing only a gray t-shirt stained with sweat. He held a clipboard in his left hand. He wasn't looking at Desmond or Lou. He was looking at the blacked-out routing boards. Marcus, get back to your bay, Desmond snapped. This isn't a problem for the heavy lifters. Marcus ignored him. He walked forward, his eyes scanning the chaotic sea of cardboard boxes and idle forklifts. The quiet, weary demeanor he usually carried was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, terrifying intensity. His posture was perfectly straight. He didn't look like a dock worker anymore. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield. The local server is dead, but the external data lines are still receiving the raw manifest signals from the incoming trucks, Marcus said, his voice clipped and precise. He turned to me. Jade, your terminal is directly hardwired to the external modem, correct? Yes, I stammered, taken aback by the sudden shift in his entire persona. But the software interface is gone. I don't need the interface, Marcus said. He walked past Desmond, brushed past Lou, and headed straight for the metal stairs leading to my office. Clear the terminal. Desmond finally snapped out of his shock and chased after him. Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing? You can't go up there. You're a dockhand. Marcus reached the top of the stairs, pushed open the glass door, and sat down in my rolling chair. I ran up the stairs right behind Desmond, both of us crowding into the small office. Marcus didn't even acknowledge us. He pulled the keyboard toward him, cracked his knuckles, and hit a series of keys that brought up a black command prompt screen. Boy, I will fire you right now, Desmond started, reaching out to grab Marcus's shoulder. Shut up, Marcus ordered. He didn't yell. The sheer ice in his tone froze Desmond's hand in midair. If you want to save your distribution contract and your pension, you will stand in the corner, keep quiet, and let me work. Desmond's jaw dropped. He looked at me, completely bewildered. I just shook my head slightly, mesmerized by what was happening. Marcus's hands hit the keyboard. I had always been a fast typist, but I had never seen anything like this. His fingers blurred over the keys. Lines of complex raw code began flying across the black screen at a dizzying speed. He wasn't just bypassing the broken software, he was writing a makeshift routing program from scratch, directly into the command prompt. He didn't hesitate. He didn't pause to think. He was building an algorithm in real time, pulling the raw data from the external modem and forcing it to translate into routing coordinates. Lou, Marcus shouted down to the floor without looking away from the screen. I'm pushing a manual override to your scanners in 60 seconds. The barcodes won't give you product names, they will only give you a 3-digit alphanumeric code. A 1 through F9. I'm grouping the trucks by regional zip codes instead of individual retailers. It cuts the sorting time by 40%. You can't do that, Lou yelled back from the floor. The corporate guidelines say. Corporate isn't standing on a dead floor bleeding $10,000 a minute, Marcus snapped back, his eyes locked on the scrolling code. I am. Get your men ready. 45 seconds later, Marcus hit the enter key with a resounding clack. A heavy, breathless silence hung in the warehouse. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then the digital routing boards above the loading bays flickered. The black screens buzzed, flashed green, and suddenly illuminated with rows of crisp, reorganized data. Down on the floor, the barcode scanners emitted a synchronized, triumphant chime. "Holy Mother of God," Lou whispered, staring at his scanner. "It's working. The grid is back up." The warehouse erupted into cheers. The forklift engines roared back to life, the conveyor belts whined as they began to move, and the massive backlog of pallets instantly started flowing again, moving even faster than before thanks to Marcus's streamlined zip code grouping. In the office, Desmond was staring at Marcus as if he had just watched a man walk on water. Marcus leaned back in the rolling chair, exhaled a long breath, and rubbed his temples. The intense, authoritative general was gone, replaced once again by the quiet, guarded man I knew. He stood up and looked at Desmond. "The patch will hold for exactly 12 hours, Marcus said quietly. "Tell your IT department they need to install a new server before midnight, or the memory cache will overflow and crash again." Desmond swallowed hard. He looked at the screen full of custom code, then back at the man in the dirty t-shirt. Who exactly are you?" "Just a dock worker who needed the line to keep moving so I could get my paycheck today," Marcus said smoothly. He walked past Desmond, heading for the stairs. "I'm taking my 15-minute break." I followed him out of the office, my heart pounding in my chest. I caught up to him by the vending machines in the break room. He was inserting a crumpled dollar bill to buy a bottle of water. "Marcus," I said, my voice low so the other workers wouldn't hear. He didn't turn around. He pushed the button for the water. "People who read books don't hard-code temporary routing algorithms to save multi-million-dollar distribution hubs," I said. He caught the heavy plastic bottle as it dropped, finally turning to face me. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard. He looked at me for a long time, his dark eyes searching my face, trying to decide how much of the truth I could handle. "I told you," he said softly. "It's just a puzzle, Jade. I'm just good at puzzles." He walked away before I could push him further. But everything had changed. Desmond didn't let Marcus go back to the dock. By the end of the shift, Marcus had been officially pulled off heavy labor and promoted to floor supervisor, complete with a substantial raise and an actual salary. While Marcus was securing our future on the warehouse floor, the ghost of my past was, unknowingly, engineering her own destruction. Because I was the lead freight coordinator, I had access to a stable internet connection in the office. Later that afternoon, during a quiet moment while Marcus was managing the floor, I logged into my old personal email account. I hadn't checked it in months. I had assumed it was nothing but spam and missed connections. But sitting in my inbox were 4 urgent messages. They were forwarded from an old shared family email address my father had set up years ago for household bills and account. Renee clearly didn't know how to untangle from my personal recovery email. The subject line of the most recent email, dated 3 days ago, made my blood run cold. Urgent notice of default and imminent foreclosure proceeding, Magnolia Ridge. I clicked the email, my hands shaking. It was a digital copy of a certified letter sent by a predatory private lending firm in downtown Atlanta. The letter was addressed to Renee. I read the details, and the sheer stupidity of her actions washed over me in waves of disbelief. When my father died, the life insurance policy was substantial. It should have lasted her for decades if managed properly. But Renee wasn't interested in management. She was interested in maintaining an illusion. The designer clothes, the luxury renovations, the weekly trips to the country club she had burned through the cash reserves in less than 3 years. Instead of getting a job or downsizing, she had done the unthinkable. 6 months ago, she had taken out a massive, high-interest balloon loan against the equity of the Magnolia Ridge house to buy a brand-new luxury SUV and fund a trip to the Bahamas. The lender was a man named Garrett, a notorious local shark who specialized in giving desperate wealthy people enough rope to hang themselves. According to the letter, Renee had defaulted on the last 3 payments. The grace period had expired. Garrett's firm was officially initiating foreclosure proceedings. She was going to lose the house, my father's house. The house she had trapped me in, the house she had thrown me out of. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound, chilling sense of karmic alignment. She had given me away to a homeless man because I was a burden she could no longer afford. She had discarded me to save herself, and in doing so, she had removed the only person in that house who actually knew how to balance a budget and keep the lights on. That evening, as we walked back to our room on Mott Street, the winter wind howling through the alleyways, I told Marcus. We were sitting on the floor, eating takeout from a small Jamaican spot down the street, a luxury afforded by Marcus's new promotion. I watched him as I explained the emails, the predatory loan, the impending foreclosure. Marcus stopped eating. He set his fork down on the plastic container. He looked at the peeling wallpaper of our tiny room, and then he looked at me. "She threw you away," he said, his voice laced with a cold, protective anger, "and kept the house, and now she's going to lose it all. She has until the end of January to produce $60,000 in back payments and penalties," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "Chew, or the bank takes the keys." Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The harsh overhead light cast deep shadows across the sharp angles of his face. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently covering mine. His skin was warm. "Jade," he said softly, his dark eyes boring into my soul. "You are not going to lift a single finger to help her. Do you understand me? You are never going back to Magnolia Ridge. You are never going to be a maid for a woman who didn't see your worth." I looked down at our hands. "I have no power to help her anyway, Marcus. We live above a dry cleaner." A strange, cryptic smile touched the corners of Marcus's mouth. It was a smile that didn't belong to a warehouse supervisor. It was the smile of a man who knew a secret that could shatter the world. "You'd be surprised," he murmured, his thumb gently brushing across my knuckles. "You'd be very surprised how much power you actually have." January arrived in Atlanta with a brutal, unapologetic freeze. The sky was a perpetual sheet of white-gray iron, and the wind whipping through the alleyways off Mott Street felt like shattered glass against the skin. But inside our tiny one-room apartment above the dry cleaner, it was a sanctuary. Marcus and I had found a rhythm that felt more like a synchronized dance. My role at the warehouse had expanded. Desmond relied on me entirely to manage the digital logistics of the freight floor, and my paychecks reflected that trust. Marcus, having firmly established himself as the most capable floor supervisor the company had seen in a decade, moved through the chaotic warehouse with a quiet, undisputed authority. We bought a thick, woolen rug for the laminate floor of our apartment. We bought a small space heater that glowed a cheerful orange in the dark. We bought actual groceries, filling the small mini-fridge with fresh vegetables and real butter. Yet, as the weeks ticked closer to the deadline of Renee's foreclosure, I noticed a subtle shift in Marcus. He started taking long walks at night after I fell asleep. Sometimes I would wake up at 3 a.m. to the sound of the radiator hissing, only to find his cot empty and his heavy canvas jacket missing from the hook by the door. When I looked out our single window, I would see him standing in the pool of light beneath the street lamp across the alley, speaking softly into a sleek black smartphone. A phone I had never seen him use during the day. A phone that certainly didn't match a man who had been sleeping in a parking garage 3 months prior. When he returned, his shoulders would be tense, his jaw set in a hard, calculating line. But the moment he saw I was awake, the storm in his eyes would vanish, replaced by the gentle, protective warmth he always reserved for me. "Everything okay?" I asked, one night, pulling my mother's quilt up to my chin as he locked the deadbolt. "Everything is perfectly fine, Jade," he whispered, taking off his boots. "Just tying up some loose ends. Go back to sleep." I trusted him implicitly, so I didn't push, but the puzzle of Marcus was becoming increasingly complex. He spoke with the vocabulary of an Ivy League scholar. He handled high-pressure logistics like a seasoned executive, and occasionally, when he looked at the sprawling skyline of downtown Atlanta from our window, he didn't look at it like a man trying to survive the city. He looked at it like a man who owned it. The last Thursday of January finally arrived. It was the exact date listed on the digital foreclosure notice sitting in my email inbox. I woke up at 5 a.m., my stomach tied in tight, nauseating knots. I sat on the edge of my cot, staring at the scuffed floorboards. Today was the day the bank was legally allowed to lock the doors of the house on Magnolia Ridge. The house my father built, the house where I had scrubbed every inch of baseboard until my fingers bled. Marcus was already awake, pouring 2 mugs of instant coffee. He walked over and handed me one, his fingers brushing against mine. "You're thinking about the house," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I took a sip of the bitter coffee, letting the heat ground me. I can't stop thinking about it. I know I shouldn't care. I know she deserves whatever happens today. But it's the only piece of my father I have left in this world, Marcus. Just knowing strangers are going to walk through those doors and take it, it makes me feel like I'm failing him. Marcus knelt in front of me, forcing me to look away from the floor and into his dark, steady eyes. "You did not fail him, Jade," he said, his voice a low, fierce rumble. "Renee failed him. Renee failed you. You survived. God, there is a massive difference." He stood up, taking my coffee mug and setting it on the counter alongside his own. He walked over to the door and pulled his heavy jacket off the hook. He tossed me my winter coat. "Put it on," he instructed. "We don't have to be at the warehouse for another hour," I said, confused. "We aren't going to the warehouse today," Marcus replied, pulling a pair of leather gloves from his pockets. "I called Desmond last night and told him we needed a personal day. He didn't ask questions." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Marcus, where are we going?" He opened the door and looked back at me, his expression entirely unreadable. "We are going to Magnolia Ridge. You need closure, and I need to make sure you get it." The journey back to the suburbs felt like crossing into a different dimension. We took the MARTA train to the end of the line, then caught a municipal bus that slowly carried us out of the grit of the city and into the sprawling, manicured affluence of northern Atlanta. As the cracked concrete gave way to smooth, black asphalt and towering oak trees, a suffocating weight settled on my chest. I shrank into the hard plastic seat of the bus, suddenly hyper-aware of my faded jeans and the scuffs on my boots. I felt like the helpless 21-year-old girl again, trapped in a life of servitude. Marcus must have sensed the shift in my posture. He reached across the small space between us and took my hand, his grip firm and anchoring. He didn't say a word, but the steady pressure of his palm against mine was a lifeline. We stepped off the bus a mile from the neighborhood entrance and walked the rest of the way. The sky was threatening snow, the air so cold it burned my lungs. When we finally turned onto Magnolia Ridge Drive, my steps slowed to a halt. There it was. The house looked exactly the same. The pristine white siding, the sprawling wraparound porch, the custom teal shutters. The hanging ferns were dead, brown and withered from the winter frost, but the imposing arrogance of the architecture remained intact. However, the scene unfolding on the front lawn was anything but perfect. 2 white sheriff's department cruisers were parked at steep angles in the driveway, their light bars flashing a silent, rhythmic blue against the overcast sky. A massive, unmarked moving box truck idled by the curb. 2 burly men in heavy coats smoking cigarettes against the back bumper, waiting for the all-clear to begin hauling furniture. Standing on the front steps, flanked by 2 stone-faced deputies, was Garrett, the predatory lender. He was a small, sharp-featured man wearing a tailored gray suit that cost more than a car, and he was smiling a thin, oily smile that made my stomach turn. And then I saw Renee. She was standing on the dead grass of the front lawn, and she looked completely unhinged. The polished, untouchable country club facade had been violently ripped away. She was wearing a silk robe over her clothes, her hair undone and blowing wildly in the freezing wind. She was clutching a designer handbag to her chest like a shield, screaming at Garrett. "You cannot do this," Renee shrieked, her voice echoing down the quiet, affluent street. Several neighbors were standing on their porches watching the spectacle with a mixture of horror and thinly veiled delight. I have a grace period. I spoke to my lawyer. You cannot physically remove me from my property. It is no longer your property, Mrs. Sterling, Garrett said smoothly, pulling a folded legal document from his breast pocket. The grace period expired at midnight. The foreclosure is absolute. You defaulted on a high-yield balloon loan. You had 6 months to produce the capital, and you chose to ignore my calls. The deputies are here to ensure you vacate the premises so the bank can take possession. I just need 1 more week, she pleaded, the arrogant fire suddenly breaking into frantic desperation. I can liquidate some assets. I have friends who can float me the cash. Your friends stopped answering your calls 3 weeks ago, Garrett replied, entirely bored by her panic. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever personal items you can fit into your vehicle. After that, the locks are changed and everything left inside becomes the property of the estate. I stood on the sidewalk 30 feet away, watching the woman who had terrorized me for 4 years completely unravel. I thought I would feel a sense of vindictive joy. I thought I would want to laugh. But standing there, feeling the biting winter wind, I only felt a profound, heavy pity. She was empty. She had traded her humanity for a house she couldn't even keep, and then she turned her head. Through the tangled mess of her hair, her eyes locked onto mine. She froze. The screaming stopped. For a second, absolute confusion washed over her face. She looked at my healthy posture, the color in my cheeks, the clean clothes. She looked at Marcus, standing tall and broad beside me, no longer a hollowed-out ghost, but a man radiating quiet, dangerous power. The confusion shifted rapidly into a desperate, feral hope. She dropped her designer bag on the frosted grass and lunged forward, running across the lawn toward me. Jade! She cried out, her voice cracking. Jade, thank God you're here! She stopped a few feet in front of me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. She reached out as if to grab my arms, but Marcus stepped smoothly into her path, his body an impenetrable wall between us. Renee recoiled, looking up at him with a flash of the old aristocratic disgust, but she quickly suppressed it and leaned around him to look at me. See what they're doing to us? She demanded, tears of pure rage streaming down her face. They are trying to throw me out of your father's house. Where have you been? Elle, you must have money by now. You have that business degree. Who are you working for? Well, tell this snake of a lender that you are paying the back balance. Tell him to get off our lawn. She was breathless, entirely consumed by her own delusion. Even after throwing me to a homeless stranger on a freezing porch, she still viewed me as her personal asset, a safety net to be deployed when her own recklessness caught up with her. I stepped out from behind Marcus. I looked at the house, my eyes lingering on the second-story window that used to be my bedroom. Then I looked back at Renee. I don't have $60,000, Renee, I said, my voice shockingly calm. It didn't tremble. It didn't waver. And even if I did, I wouldn't give you a single dime. Her mouth opened in shock. What? Elle, Jade, this is your father's house. This is your home. You're just going to let them take it from me? You took it from me 4 years ago, I replied, the truth ringing clear and absolute in the crisp air. You locked the deadbolt. You made your choice. You thought I was a burden holding you down. Well, the burden is gone. Let's see how well you float. Renee's face contorted into an ugly, vicious sneer. The desperation vanished, replaced by the venomous cruelty I knew so well. You ungrateful little brat, she spat, taking a step toward me. I put a roof over your head. I fed you. You are nothing without this family name. You're going to end up in the gutter with this street trash you dragged back here. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even look angry. He just stared at her with a look of clinical fascination, as if observing a fascinating, tragic insect. Suddenly, Garrett cleared his throat loudly from the porch steps. While this family reunion is incredibly touching, Garrett called out, checking a gold watch on his wrist, I'm afraid your time is up, Mrs. Sterling. Deputies, escort her to her car. The movers are going in. Renee whipped around, her face pale. No, you can't. Actually, a new voice interrupted. It was Marcus. He spoke at a normal volume, but the resonance of his voice commanded absolute silence. The deputies paused. Garrett looked up, squinting at the tall, imposing black man standing on the sidewalk. "I'm sorry," Garrett sneered. "And who exactly are you? The bodyguard?" Marcus slowly unbuttoned his canvas jacket. He reached into the inner breast pocket and pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He didn't look at Garrett. He looked down at the screen, tapped it once, and then looked back up at the house. "Mr. Garrett," Marcus said, his voice entirely stripped of the weary warehouse supervisor persona. It was sharp, authoritative, and terrifyingly precise. "You represent Vanguard Financial Lending, correct?" Garrett frowned, his smug demeanor faltering slightly at the sudden shift in Marcus's tone. "I am the regional director of Vanguard, yes. Not that it's any of your business." "It is entirely my business," Marcus replied smoothly. He took 3 steps forward, walking onto the frosted grass. "Because, as of 8 a.m. this morning, Vanguard Financial Lending no longer holds the deed to this property. Or any property, for that matter." Garrett let out a harsh, barking laugh. "What are you talking about? Are you high? We initiated this foreclosure 6 months ago." "And you executed it poorly," Marcus countered, never raising his voice. "Your firm was heavily leveraged in high-risk municipal bonds. You were operating on a razor-thin margin of liquidity. So last night, a private holdings corporation executed a hostile, expedited buyout of Vanguard's entire residential debt portfolio. You don't own the paper on this house anymore, Garrett. You don't own the paper on anything. You're unemployed." Garrett stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He reached into his own coat, frantically pulling out his cell phone. He stared at the screen. It was lit up with dozens of missed calls and frantic text messages from his corporate office. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of ash. What did you do?" Garrett stammered, dropping his phone onto the lawn. "Who the hell are you?" Renee was looking back and forth between Garrett and Marcus, completely lost, her mind unable to process the shifting power dynamic. At the exact moment, a massive jet-black luxury SUV turned onto Magnolia Ridge Drive. It didn't park on the street. It pulled smoothly into the driveway directly behind the sheriff's cruisers. The engine purred with terrifying, expensive power. The back door opened and a man stepped out. He was an older African-American gentleman wearing a perfectly tailored navy pinstripe suit, carrying a thick, leather-bound folio. He adjusted his silver wire-rimmed glasses, ignored the deputies, ignored Renee, and walked straight across the grass toward Marcus. When he reached us, the older man stopped, offered a deep, respectful nod, and held out the folio. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," the lawyer said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet morning air. "Like that, this went through exactly as you orchestrated. The offshore accounts were completely unfrozen at midnight following the board's formal surrender. Vanguard's debt portfolio has been fully absorbed by your parent company." Marcus took the folio. "Thank you, David. Did you file the specific transfer deed I requested?" "I did, sir," David replied with a slight smile. "The property at 414 Magnolia Ridge is now entirely free and clear of all liens and encumbrances. The deed has been transferred to the new owner." I was frozen. My brain simply stopped functioning. I looked at the man I had shared a piece of concrete with, the man I had eaten 50-cent cans of beans with on the floor of a tiny room. "Mr. Sterling. My father's last name was Sterling. Renee's last name was Sterling. But this lawyer had just called Marcus, Mr. Sterling." Marcus turned to look at me. The guarded, weary walls he had kept up for 3 months were completely gone. In their place was a man of unfathomable wealth and unchecked power, looking at me with the exact same gentle devotion he had shown me in the dark of that parking garage. He opened the leather folio. Inside, resting on top of a stack of legal documents, was a heavy brass key with a teal ribbon tied through the loop. He pulled the key out and stepped toward me. He reached out, gently taking my trembling hand, and pressed the cold brass into my palm, curling my fingers around it. "I told you," Marcus whispered, his eyes locked onto mine. "You'd be very surprised how much power you actually have. He turned back to face the stunned crowd on the lawn. He looked at Garrett, who looked like he was about to pass out. "You can take your moving truck and leave, Garrett," Marcus commanded. "Your services are no longer required." Then Marcus turned his gaze to Renee. Renee was trembling so violently she could barely stand. She looked at the brass key in my hand, then at the billionaire standing beside me, the very same man she had treated like dirt on her shoes, the man she had thrown me away to as a twisted joke. The realization of what she had done, the apocalyptic scale of her own catastrophic mistake, finally crashed down upon her. "Jade," Renee whispered, her voice a hollow, broken gasp. "Jade, please." I looked at the brass key in my hand. I looked at the house. I looked at the teal shutters that had felt like prison bars for 4 years. And then I looked at Marcus. I didn't owe her anger. I didn't owe her an explanation. I only owed myself the freedom she had unwittingly given me. "Deputies," I said, my voice ringing out with an authority I didn't know I possessed. The 2 officers who had been watching the entire exchange in stunned silence straightened up. "Yes, ma'am," one of them replied. I looked Renee dead in the eyes, offering her exactly the same amount of grace she had offered me on that October afternoon. "Please escort this woman off my property," I said. "She's trespassing." The heavy oak door of the house on Magnolia Ridge closed behind us, and the sound it made was entirely different this time. 4 months ago, when Renee had slammed it shut, the heavy thud of the wood against the frame had sounded like a gavel falling on a prison sentence. Today, as Marcus gently pushed it closed, the soft click of the latch sounded like a deep, shuddering exhale. It sounded like peace. We stood in the foyer. The house was dead quiet. The deputies had supervised Renee as she frantically stuffed 2 designer suitcases with whatever she could grab from her walk-in closet before escorting her off the premises. The moving company, retained by David, had already begun the process of clearing out the furniture she had bought with the predatory loan money. I stood on the imported Italian tile, still wearing my faded winter coat and the scuffed boots I had worked in at the warehouse. I looked at the grand, sweeping staircase. I looked at the crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling. I looked at the spot in the kitchen archway where I had dropped the wet dishcloth on that freezing October afternoon. It felt surreal. I was a ghost haunting a life I used to live, only the haunting was in reverse. The house was exactly as I remembered it, yet it held absolutely no power over me anymore. "How does it feel?" Marcus asked. He was standing a few feet behind me, giving me the physical space to process the emotional whiplash of the morning. He had taken off his leather gloves and slipped his phone back into his coat pocket. The formidable, terrifying billionaire who had just verbally dismantled a regional banking director was gone. He was just Marcus again, my Marcus. I took a slow, deep breath. The air smelled of Renee's expensive, cloying floral perfume, mixed with the sharp scent of the lemon polish she had forced me to use on the banisters every Tuesday. "It feels heavy," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper in the cavernous space. "It feels like a museum dedicated to someone else's vanity. But underneath all of that, it feels like my father is finally allowed to rest." Marcus nodded slowly. He stepped forward, his boots making a soft sound against the tile, and came to stand beside me. He looked around the pristine, sterile living room. "We can sell it tomorrow," he said casually, as if offering to throw away a cracked coffee mug. "David can have it listed by noon. We can buy a penthouse downtown. We can buy a farm in the country. We can leave Atlanta entirely and never look back. It's your asset now, Jade. You don't have to spend a single night inside these walls if they only bring you pain." I turned to look at him. "You bought a multi-million-dollar residential debt portfolio just to hand me the deed to a house you want me to sell?" A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, reaching his dark eyes and softening the sharp angles of his jaw. "I bought a multi-million-dollar debt portfolio because it was a sound financial acquisition for my parent company," he corrected smoothly, though the warmth in his voice betrayed the corporate jargon. "Handing you the deed to this specific property was just a very satisfying fringe benefit, but my offer stands. We don't have to stay." I looked back up the staircase. I thought about my bedroom at the end of the hall. I thought about the ghost of my father whose memory had been suffocated by Renee's overwhelming arrogance. "No," I said firmly, the decision cementing itself in my chest. "She doesn't get to chase me out of my own home twice, but we are not keeping it like this. I want her perfume out of the air. I want the teal shutters ripped off the front exterior. I want every single piece of furniture she bought with that blood money donated to a women's shelter. I want to strip this place down to the studs if we have to, and rebuild it into something that actually breathes." Marcus's smile widened. "I know a very capable logistics coordinator who is excellent at organizing large-scale projects," he teased gently. I let out a shaky laugh, the remaining tension in my shoulders finally snapping. I reached out and wrapped my arms around his waist, burying my face in the heavy canvas of his jacket. He responded instantly, his strong arms wrapping around my shoulders, pulling me flush against his chest. I listened to the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart. It was the same heartbeat I had listened to in the freezing darkness of the parking structure, the same heartbeat that had anchored me in the tiny room above the dry cleaner. "You owe me a massive explanation, Mr. Sterling," I murmured against his coat. He rested his chin on the top of my head, letting out a heavy sigh. "I know. Let's go to the kitchen. I'll make the coffee this time." We sat at the massive marble island in the center of the kitchen, the very same island where I had burned my wrist pulling Renee's pecans from the oven. Marcus found a bag of dark roast beans in the pantry, navigated the ridiculously complex espresso machine with the ease of a seasoned barista, and set a steaming mug in front of me. He sat on the stool next to mine, wrapping his large hands around his own mug. He looked down into the dark liquid for a long time before he spoke. "My name is Marcus Sterling, but the company I built is called Sterling Vance Technologies," he began, his voice low and measured. "We specialize in developing high-level proprietary logistics software for international shipping conglomerates. The algorithms I wrote revolutionized how automated freighters navigate oceanic supply chains. By the time I was 25, the company was valued at just over $2 billion. I stared at him, my mind struggling to reconcile the astronomical numbers with the man who had been thrilled to earn $120 in cash at a warehouse day labor line. "I brought in a board of directors to handle the corporate expansion," Marcus continued, his jaw tightening. "Men with Ivy League degrees and decades of Wall Street experience. I trusted them to run the business while I focused on the engineering. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was trusting my chief financial officer, a man named Vance. He was my mentor. I viewed him like a second father." Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes darkening as he pulled the memories forward. Last September, Vance and the board orchestrated a blindside maneuver. They fabricated a massive trail of financial discrepancies, funneling corporate funds into shell accounts and attaching my digital signature to the transfers. They went to a federal judge under seal, claiming I was embezzling millions and preparing to flee the country. They secured an emergency injunction. Within 24 hours, all of my personal and professional accounts were frozen. I was locked out of my own servers. And I received a tip from a sympathetic clerk in the SEC that a federal indictment was dropping on a Monday morning. "So you ran," I whispered, the pieces finally clicking into place. "I didn't run," Marcus corrected softly. "I vanished. If they arrested me, I would have been tied up in federal holding, unable to communicate, while Vance liquidated my company and sold the patents to an overseas competitor. I needed time. I needed to become a ghost so my personal legal team, David, and a few others who remained loyal could forensically dismantle their fabricated paper trail and counter-sue for corporate espionage." He looked around the pristine kitchen. "But surviving as a ghost requires leaving absolutely zero digital footprint. No credit cards, no ATM withdrawals, no hotel check-ins. I had millions sitting in untouchable offshore trusts, but I couldn't buy a loaf of bread without triggering a federal alert. So I went to the streets. I slept in shelters until they got too dangerous. I slept in parking garages. I panhandled for food." He reached out and traced the rim of my ceramic mug with his index finger. That Tuesday in October, I was quite literally starving, Marcus said, his voice dropping into a register of profound vulnerability. I was exhausted. I was losing hope that David would ever crack the case. I knocked on this door hoping for a piece of fruit, and instead the universe handed me you. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. And you didn't tell me who you were because if the feds found me, you would have been charged with aiding and abetting a fugitive, he stated, his protective instinct flaring. I couldn't risk pulling you into the crossfire. And besides, the woman who walked out of this house with me didn't care about my bank account. She gave me half of her mother's quilt when she thought I had absolutely nothing. I needed to hold on to that. It was the only real thing in a world that had entirely betrayed me. A tear slipped free, hot and fast rolling down my cheek. Marcus reached out, his thumb gently wiping it away. David finally broke the encryption on Vance's shell accounts 3 weeks ago, Marcus finished, the edge returning to his voice. We presented the raw data directly to a federal judge. The injunction was lifted, my assets were unfrozen, and Vance is currently sitting in a federal penitentiary awaiting trial for wire fraud and perjury. I took my company back. And then I had David look into Vanguard Financial Lending just to tie up one final personal loose end. You bought a bank, I said, a watery smile breaking through the tears, just to fire Garrett and kick my stepmother out of my house. I'm a very thorough man, Jade, he replied, his eyes sparkling with a dangerous, playful light. The transition back to Magnolia Ridge did not happen overnight. We refused to sleep in the house while it still carried the oppressive weight of its former occupant. Instead, we spent the next 2 months living in a luxury high-rise penthouse in Midtown Atlanta, coordinating the most aggressive home renovation the suburbs had ever seen. I didn't hire an interior designer. I did it myself. I used the organizational skills I had honed at the warehouse to manage a fleet of contractors. We tore up the pristine Italian tile and laid down rich, warm mahogany floorboards. We painted the sterile white walls in soft, inviting earth tones. The imposing crystal chandelier in the foyer was replaced with a modern, elegant, wrought iron fixture, and the custom teal shutters, the ultimate symbol of Renee's superficial vanity, were unceremoniously ripped off the siding with a crowbar and thrown directly into a commercial dumpster. We brought exactly 2 things from our past into the newly renovated home. The first was my mother's patchwork quilt, which found a permanent place folded at the foot of our massive California king bed. The second was a surprise orchestrated by Marcus. On a warm Tuesday in April moving day, I walked into the newly designed kitchen and stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting at the new butcher block island, drinking a beer and laughing loudly, were Desmond and Lou. "What are you guys doing here?" I gasped, dropping a box of kitchen supplies. Desmond, wearing a clean polo shirt without a coffee stain in sight, stood up and grinned. "Well, your boy Marcus here bought the Kellner Street warehouse 2 weeks ago, fired the corporate oversight board, doubled our pensions, and made me the regional director of physical logistics for his tech company. Lou is the new warehouse manager." I looked at Marcus, who was leaning against the refrigerator with a quiet, satisfied smile. "You guys walked out on a shift and never came back," Lou chimed in, shaking his head in disbelief. "We thought you got arrested." Next thing I know, a fleet of black SUVs rolls up to the loading dock, and the guy who used to stack pallets for $15 an hour steps out wearing a bespoke suit and buys the entire building. "They were the only 2 men who gave me a chance when I looked like a liability," Marcus said, walking over and wrapping an arm around my waist. "And Desmond is the only manager who recognized your brilliance. Loyalty should be rewarded." The house on Magnolia Ridge finally felt like a home. It was filled with laughter, the smell of real food, and the warmth of genuine connection. I didn't return to the warehouse, nor did I take a corporate job at an Atlanta firm. Instead, Marcus and I established the Sterling Foundation, a massive philanthropic organization dedicated to providing immediate, no-questions-asked financial and legal intervention for young adults aging out of the foster system or escaping domestic abuse. I was named the executive director. I used my business degree, my logistical expertise, and every ounce of empathy I had forged in the fires of my past to build a safety net for people who felt as invisible as I once had. As for Renee, karma handled her with a quiet, devastating efficiency. I only saw her one more time. It was late August and the brutal Georgia summer was in full swing. I was downtown, leaving a meeting with a local zoning commissioner regarding a new housing project. Our foundation was funding. I stepped out of the air-conditioned municipal building and walked toward the sleek black sedan waiting for me at the curb. I paused at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. To my right, sitting on a concrete bench at a bus stop, was a woman. It took me a few seconds to recognize her. The polished, aristocratic aura was entirely gone. She was wearing a faded, poorly fitting uniform for a local discount retail chain. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, was pulled back in a messy, defeated ponytail. The designer handbag had been replaced by a cheap canvas tote bag. She looked exhausted, aged 10 years in the span of 8 months. She was staring blankly at the traffic, her jaw set in a hard, bitter line. She had lost the house, lost the cars, and lost the country club friends who only tolerated her for her perceived wealth. She was completely, utterly alone, forced to participate in the grueling reality of the working class she had spent her entire life mocking. The pedestrian light chirped, signaling it was safe to cross. I didn't call out to her. I didn't feel the need to gloat or rub my victory in her face. The universe had already balanced the scales perfectly. I simply stepped off the curb, crossed the street, climbed into the back of my waiting car and told the driver to take me home to my husband. Time is a strange architect. It can stretch seconds of suffering into agonizing eternities, and it can compress months of healing into a fleeting golden blur. Exactly 1 year after the inciting incident that shattered my life, the air in Atlanta turned crisp and cool, signaling the arrival of October. The leaves on the massive oak trees lining Magnolia Ridge began to shift into vibrant shades of amber and crimson. But the chill in the air didn't carry the threat of survival anymore. It only carried the promise of a new season. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 365 days since Renee had pointed a manicured finger at my chest and told a starving man on the porch to take me away. I stood in front of a full-length mirror in the master bedroom. I wasn't wearing one of the 3 faded cotton shirts I used to cycle through. I was wearing a stunning, simple white silk dress that draped perfectly across my frame. My dark hair, which I used to pull into a tight, practical bun to keep out of the way of my chores, was styled in soft, elegant waves that fell past my shoulders. The woman staring back at me didn't look like a burden. She looked powerful. She looked loved. She looked completely free. There was a soft knock on the bedroom door. David, the older, distinguished lawyer who had become a trusted friend and a surrogate uncle to both of us, stepped into the room. He was wearing a sharp charcoal suit, a yellow rose pinned meticulously to his lapel. "The car is waiting downstairs, Jade," David said, his eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine warmth. He looked at me, a soft paternal pride radiating from his posture. "You look absolutely breathtaking." "Thank you, David," I smiled, grabbing a small white clutch from the dresser. "Is he nervous?" David chuckled, adjusting his silver wire-rimmed glasses. "Marcus, I've seen that man stare down a hostile board of directors and casually bankrupt a corrupt lending firm without blinking an eye. But right now, pacing the courthouse steps, he looks like he might faint if a strong breeze hits him." I laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed in the warm room. "Let's go put him out of his misery." We didn't book a massive cathedral. We didn't invite hundreds of corporate elites or high society socialites. Marcus and I had survived the darkest parts of the world by stripping our lives down to the absolute essentials, and we wanted our wedding to reflect that exact same truth. The Fulton County Courthouse in downtown Atlanta was a towering, historic structure of pale stone and grand columns. As David's sedan pulled up to the curb, I saw them waiting at the top of the wide concrete steps. Desmond and Lou were there, wearing suits that looked slightly uncomfortable on their broad, warehouse-hardened shoulders, but grinning from ear to ear. Miss Tanya, a sweet, elderly neighbor from Mott Street who used to sneak us extra laundry tokens when we lived above the dry cleaner, was standing next to them, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. And standing in the center waiting for me was Marcus. He wore a custom, tailored black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, looking every bit the billionaire tech magnate the world knew him to be. But as I stepped out of the car and began to walk up the steps, the corporate armor melted away. His dark, intense eyes locked onto mine, and the rest of the world simply ceased to exist. He didn't look at me like a man securing an asset. He looked at me the way he had on our wedding day, a man who had finally found the missing piece of his soul. I reached the top of the stairs and he reached out, taking both of my hands in his. His hands were still warm, still calloused, still the exact same hands that had built a routing algorithm from scratch to save our jobs. "You're late," he whispered playfully, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm exactly on time," I replied, squeezing his hands. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a smiling municipal judge in a small, sunlit room overlooking the city skyline. We didn't write flowery, abstract vows. We didn't need to. Our vows had been spoken in the silence of a freezing parking garage, in the shared steam of instant coffee, and in the unspoken promise to never let the other face the darkness alone again. "By the power vested in me by the state of Georgia," the judge finally smiled, closing his leather binder, "I pronounce you husband and wife. You may seal your vows." Marcus didn't hesitate. He pulled me into his arms, his hand resting gently on the small of my back, and kissed me. It wasn't a desperate kiss of survival. It was a deep, anchoring promise of forever. The small room erupted into cheers. I could hear Desmond whistling loudly over Miss Tanya's happy tears. Afterward, we stood on the grand courthouse steps in the crisp October sun. The city of Atlanta moved below us, taxis rushing past, couriers on bicycles, strangers navigating the complex machinery of their own lives. Marcus turned to me, the autumn light catching the gold band now resting on his left hand. He looked at me with an expression of profound, quiet awe, as if he still couldn't quite believe the universe had allowed him to keep me. "I have something for you," he said softly. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo, the same pocket where he used to keep the sleek black smartphone that held the keys to his empire. But this time, he didn't pull out a phone. He pulled out a small, flat velvet box. He opened it. Inside, resting on the dark fabric, was a thin, delicate silver bracelet. It wasn't dripping in diamonds. It wasn't a gaudy, ostentatious display of his immense wealth. It was simple, elegant, and entirely perfect. I held my breath as he lifted it from the box. In the center of the silver chain was a small, polished plate. I leaned in to look at the delicate engraving etched into the metal. "Not alone anymore." I looked up at him, my vision blurring with fresh tears. "I had it engraved at a little shop on Mott Street," Marcus explained, his voice rough with emotion. "The woman at the counter asked what I wanted it to say. I stood there for a long time trying to summarize everything you are to me, everything you saved me from, and that was the only truth that mattered." I pressed my lips together, fighting a losing battle against my tears. I held out my left wrist, and he gently fastened the silver clasp, his warm fingers brushing against my skin. The metal was cool, but it carried a weight that anchored me to the earth. I reached out and traced the engraved letters with my thumb. "You know what I think about sometimes?" I said, my voice low, blending with the distant hum of the city below. Marcus stepped closer, wrapping his arms around my waist. "What?" I looked away from the bracelet and up into the deep dark eyes of the man who had changed my entire universe. I thought about the woman who was currently scrubbing floors in a discount retail store, trapped in a prison of her own arrogant design. "She thought she was getting rid of a burden," I whispered, the final remnants of my past trauma dissolving into the cool autumn wind. "She thought she was throwing me away." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding exactly where my mind had gone. "And what did she actually do?" A profound, unbreakable smile spread across my face. I rested my hands flat against his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart beneath the fine tuxedo fabric. "All she actually did," I said, "was set me free." Marcus smiled, a brilliant, unrestrained flash of pure joy. He pulled me tighter against him, resting his forehead against mine. "She threw away the best thing she ever had," he murmured, "and it will forever be her greatest loss and my greatest fortune."